Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next installment of our great book series on the Odyssey. This one we ended up splitting into two parts, just like the Iliad, so this is part one. Michael and I very much enjoyed reading the Odyssey as well as this conversation, and we hope you will too. For those of you watching on YouTube, I apologize that there's no video on this one. I won't bore you with the details, but the short version is that due to technical difficulties involving video files downloaded from Google Hangouts, the video of our conversation was basically unusable. Fortunately, there was nothing wrong with the audio, so enjoy looking at some Odyssey-themed artwork during this one instead of at our faces. So without further ado, here are some of our thoughts on the Odyssey.
So, Jason and I just finished reading The Odyssey by Homer, and this is our second book in our quest to read all the great books of Western civilization. And the Odyssey is basically the story of Odysseus and his return home from the Trojan War. And the story really begins a long time after that. And it's when his son, Telemachus, he goes on a journey to go find out what happened to his dad, because it's been years and years since the war ended and he should have been home. So everyone assumes he's dead. Telemachus goes on a quest to try and find him or to find out what happened. He doesn't really have a lot of hope at first that Odysseus is alive. But then Odysseus has his own quest, his own story, and they're kind of separate, but he makes his way home. And it all really begins because Odysseus' wife, I forget her name, I'm sure Jason remembers. Penelope. There's a bunch of suitors who are trying to marry her after Odysseus is, they think, dead. And she's very beautiful and very rich, and all the best princes and nobility of Ithaca are trying to marry Odysseus' wife. So they spend years and years basically, eating up all of Telemachus' food and drinking all of his wine, and basically destroying his house and making him poor just by eating all of his food and drinking all of his wine, and partying every night for years and years while they're waiting for Penelope to pick one of them to marry. And she keeps running them along and leading them on because she's just still too heartbroken over Odysseus. And I don't know if it's so much that she's holding out hope. She just doesn't want to move on, it seems like.
Well, she doesn't know if he's alive, and she has a responsibility either way. Like, whether he's alive or dead, in this culture, there's no such thing as divorce, right? And so if he's alive, she has a responsibility to stay faithful to him, because of the marriage, right? But if he's dead, she also has a responsibility to marry someone else, because that's, a woman of her standing can't be single in her culture. So she has these two conflicting responsibilities that she just it's an impossible situation because she doesn't know whether he's alive or dead.
Right. Well, we can dig into each little thing. That's my basic synopsis, basic outline. If you think I've missed anything huge before we dive into anything specific.
Right. Yeah. Well, first of all, big picture, I enjoyed this better than the Iliad, I think. Like, if I'm going to compare the two, I enjoyed this one more. I thought there's a lot more variety. The Iliad is just a straight-up war story, which is, that's not a bad thing. It was interesting, too. But there's a lot more variety in the Odyssey. There's so for the first four books, are the journey that Telemachus goes on to try to find out what happened to his father. And then after that, so it jumps around in time, right? So that's kind of interesting. Like, the way it's structured is not just a linear story. So Telemachus does his thing for a little while, and then we come to Odysseus, who's being held on an island by Calypso, who's a goddess of some kind. And
a nymph, I think they call it.
Yeah. A nymph. So she's holding him there on this island as her unwilling lover. He just wants to go back home, and he's constantly longing to go back home. but she's holding him there and she won't let him go. So finally, 10 years after the war ends, she lets him go. Then he gets shipwrecked on the island of the Phaeacians and ends up telling them his story of what happened over the previous 10 years. So that's when, like, there's 4 books. I think it's like books 9 to 12 or something like that. And that's where, like, everything you think of when you think of the Odyssey is in those books. Like, this is the most famous part. So this is when he goes and encounters the Cyclops and the Lotus Eaters and the Sirens and Scylla and Charybdis and all of that. So all of those famous episodes from the Odyssey are in those 4 books. And that's like an extended flashback scene where Odysseus is telling his own story to the Phaeacians. Then after that, the Phaeacians take him the rest of the way. They're good, hospitable people, so they take him the rest of the way back to his home. And then he spends the second half of the Odyssey trying to defeat the suitors and retake his palace and restore his rightful place as king of Ithaca. Which, a side note, when I read this in middle school for class, and the translation we read called them the wooers.
Instead of the suitors?
Yeah.
The rulers.
The wooers.
Wooers. Okay. I like that better.
Yeah. But this translation just calls them the suitors. But yeah. Wooers is a funny word.
I like it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I didn't know that Helen survived Troy. I didn't know that. Like,
yeah.
She went back with Menelaus, called herself a slut, you know?
Yeah.
I guess in her defense, it was a goddess that made her do it. What a nice defense.
Yeah.
Doesn't work anymore.
Yeah, that's funny. Like when Telemachus is there talking to Menelaus,
yeah,
they're like telling stories to each other, and so I think Helen, they're talking about Odysseus, right? And they're talking about how great of a guy Odysseus is.
Yeah.
And Helen is like talking about the time they were all in the Trojan horse and how Odysseus came up with that strategy.
Mm-hmm.
And how great it was because it made him win the war. And she's telling this story, and then Menelaus comes back and says, like, yeah, we were all inside the Trojan horse, and Helen was outside, like, impersonating the voices of all of the men's wives inside and trying to get them to call out to her and give themselves away. So basically, it's like Helen was saying, yeah, remember that strategy that Odysseus came up with and how great it was? Mm-hmm. And Menelaus is then like, yeah, remember that time he came up with that strategy and then you tried to kill us all?
Yeah.
And he's the one that stopped us all from calling out so we didn't die.
Yeah.
And it's weird because, like, you know, Helen ran away with another guy. So it's like
awkward.
Yeah, they're clearly having problems in their marriage.
Yeah. 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 Yeah, I didn't know that. Like, I didn't know she survived. I didn't know she went back because I had never read the Odyssey. That seems bizarre to me that forgive and forget is still his wife. Like, all these people died because of her, and she just goes back and is queen again in Sparta. It's like, God dang. Yeah. That's funny. I think somebody would lop her head off or something. That's messed up.
Yeah, well, she's supposedly, it's kind of ambiguous whether or not she was kidnapped or went willingly.
I thought she like blamed some goddess, like she was a goddess, like got in her head or entranced her or something.
Well, yeah, it's confusing. Like, that's why it's confusing.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. It doesn't work anymore. If only the Greek gods were our gods here in America, then we could just have a lot of excuses for doing stupid or horrible things.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. There's like a joke that goes around, like the Odyssey was just one guy's long-winded explanation of why he was late getting home for dinner or something.
Yeah. Yeah. 20 years late.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we could talk about everything that happened, or if there's any specific themes that you want to dive into. That.
Yeah. Well, I think let's start with honor culture, because this story really fleshes it out. I think it gives more of a flavor to it. Like, it adds on to what we already saw from the Iliad. And I feel like it just fleshes out the culture a little bit more, because in the Iliad, all of the virtues that one uses to attain honor, like all the honorable virtues, are all military virtues, right? You have to be courageous, strong, athleticism, all of that, all the things that make a successful warrior are what brings honor to a person. And that makes sense that the Iliad would focus on those virtues, because it's a war story. The Odyssey happens mostly during peacetime. So especially in the first 4 books, the big virtue that I feel like the Iliad didn't focus on as much is speaking ability.
Yeah.
Like public speaking ability. Odysseus exemplifies that better than anyone else. He is a master of rhetoric. He has this ability to craft a story, and you see this every time he talks to a new person. He has this great ability to tailor his story to the audience that he's talking to, and so he's very effective. He's very persuasive, and he's very good at telling a story. He's almost like a bard, like the type of person that would have been performing the Odyssey to an audience in ancient Greece. He's on that level of speaking ability. In the first 4 books, when Telemachus is like 20 years old-ish at this point, 20 or 21, and he was born just before Odysseus left for the war. Odysseus spent 10 years at war and then 10 years getting back. So Telemachus is around 20 years old. And at the beginning of the story, he's maturing as a man, and he's getting to the point where he has to take charge of his father's house. He either, like, this is his responsibility now. He has to take charge and do something about the suitors, because they're violating every principle of hospitality that there is. So the first thing he does is he gets up in front of all the suitors and tells them that they need to leave, and nobody listens to him, because he doesn't know how to do this. Like, he's not a good public speaker yet. He's not mature. He comes across as kind of childish and immature, and his words don't have any force behind them. And that's a negative, right? Like, you need to be able to speak in public to be an honorable man in this culture.
Right.
So that's just something I know. Like, the value of being able to speak well.
Yeah.
Is something that this book highlighted a lot more than the Iliad, I think.
Yeah. I think they straight up mention that in a lot of ways, and then it's kind of demonstrated by not just Odysseus, but some of the other more well-known honorable characters like Menelaus, right? Like, it's like not only do they speak well, and they speak, the strong presence and all that, but they also talk about speaking. In fact, like, part of what the suitors like tease Telemachus about is like not being like that. You know what I mean? Or they're very surprised when he is like a forceful speaker, like when he speaks well. They like, and they very verbosely, describe how, like, whoa, like, where'd this guy come from? So it's not, basically you see it demonstrated by some of the more honorable characters, some of the bigger, more important characters. And you see Telemachus develop this as he goes. And in moments that are a little more impassioned, he's a little better at it, But then they also just talk about that. They talk about, how public speaking is a part of that culture. They talk about it. Like either when someone does poorly, they make fun of somebody, or if someone does a good job, that they didn't expect to, then they act all surprised about it. So yeah, it's very obvious from the dialogue that people are that speaking ability is very important and people are impressed by it.
Yeah, and Telemachus does get better at it as his part of the story goes along. Like, he's not great at it when he talks to the suitors, but then later when he goes to visit Menelaus and Nestor, he's a lot better at it. Like, Athena goes with him. She's disguised as a mortal. And I think I don't remember if it's Nestor or Menelaus when he does. I think it's Nestor. But when he goes to visit Nestor, he says to Athena, who's disguised as a friend of his, he's like basically asking advice on how to speak to Nestor. Like, because he realizes that he's not reached a high level of competence in this kind of speaking yet. So yeah. He kind of defers to his friend's judgment and is like, how do I do this? Like, coach me a little bit. And Athena encourages him basically. And he gets better at it. But, and that's part of his maturing. Like, this part of the story is Telemachus coming of age. Like, it's him maturing into a full grown man. And part of that is developing the confidence and the fortitude to be able to speak in front of people.
Right. Yep. Well, there's another thing that I related to honor culture that I noticed from this book, that it seemed very prevalent, kind of like the talking in public. That wasn't so much of a thing in the Iliad, and that is hospitality. That was like a huge part. Like, all these very important men, whenever they would have guests, when Odysseus was going from place to place, or Telemachus going from place to place, a huge part of the story was the banquets and the feasts, and they would do this stuff for their guest. It's like the guest, and they wouldn't even know the guest's name. They would be like, this stranger shows up. I mean, they didn't always not know who it was, but even like Menelaus, he didn't even ask who Telemachus was until like after he had eaten his fill. You know what I mean? And drank to his heart's content, or whatever. When they had put aside all, what was it called?
Put away the desire for eating and drinking.
The desire for eating and drinking. Then he asked him who he was. It's like, it's clear that in this culture, hospitality is as important part of honor as like anything else. Like how you treat your guests, gift giving and returning, or reciprocating gifts, things like that. It's like a huge part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually did a little bit of research about this. There's a word, the word for this in ancient Greek is xenia. And there's another word xenos, which is where we get the word xenophobia from.
Mm-hmm.
And xenos means seemingly contradictory things. It means friend, stranger, foreigner, guest, and host. It means all of those things. And this is like from the research that I did about this, that's not like an ambiguity in modern translation. Like, this word actually meant all of these things in that culture. So it's like, it's a very rigidly structured system of hospitality. Like, the word hospitality almost doesn't do it justice, because this is an obligation that you have as a member of this culture. Like, someone, the way it works is that if you're if you're traveling around somewhere and you need a place to stay for the night, you go to someone's house who's about your same standing as far as the culture goes in society. So like if you're a prince or something, you'd go to the palace. If you're a farmhand or something like that, you'd go find a farmhand's house. Someone, really relatively close to your social class, and you knock on the door and say, "Hey, I need a place to stay for the night." And they are like their social norms obligate them to take you in for the night and give you a meal. But the thing is that the obligation goes both ways. So you're also obligated to take someone else in if they come to your house needing a place to stay for the night. And there's also an obligation on both accounts. Number one, for the guest to not overstay their welcome, and for the host to not try to push them out the door before they're ready to go. So it's an interesting, it's a really interesting concept. Like, it's totally foreign to us, and I think it's interesting. And there's got to be some really strong motivations on both sides, because obviously this is like wide open for people to exploit, right? Like,
Yeah.
bad actors could very easily take advantage of this. So there's got to be a strong motivation for people to not take advantage of it.
Yeah.
Which is basically the wrath of the gods. Like, the gods will smite you if you violate this code.
Yeah, and I feel like 10 to 15% of the entire Odyssey is describing eating and drinking in one of these situations where a guest shows up, the guest is one of the main characters, or not, or whatever, and the same thing. Once they have put aside their desire for food and drink, it's like that same line is repeated like 100 times because they keep feasting all the time.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, and actually, so there's a reason they don't ask their name before they eat,
mm-hmm.
and it's because whether or not you feed them isn't supposed to depend on who they are. Like, it's not supposed to depend on whether you like them or not, or whether you've heard of them before. So the proper etiquette is to take them in, have a meal, and then you can talk about who you are. So it's weird, but interesting.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome. Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that, like, in a way, I think that kind of survived for a long time in our sense of duty or honor, even into, I think it's still a thing today, more so in the South, but I think it was certainly more of a thing, in early American history, or in like the frontier, or really outside the cities, I think, in this country for the last, maybe 100 years ago. And at some point, I feel like it started changing, but this whole like hospitality being kind of an integral part of your own personal honor, like not saying necessarily strangers, you know what I mean, that come and you don't ask who they are and you let them in, but still, like, that if honor is almost entirely, if not, like, we talk about the definition of honor, that would be a whole different episode that would take, hours, but it's hard to separate honor from reputation. Some might argue that it is, those are synonyms, like, but your honor and your reputation are tied, they're tied together, and your reputation depends a lot on your hospitality. What people, the word spreads, people know how hospitable or how inhospitable you are.
Right. Yeah. That's like, it's almost like, in order to have this culture of hospitality, this culture of Xenia, you need to first have the honor culture, because reputation has to be of utmost importance in your life, so that people have a strong incentive to not break the code of hospitality. Right.
Yeah. I just feel like honor itself isn't as I don't know, highly regarded these days, and so I think hospitality falls off with it, and I'm speaking in generalities, and it's pretty anecdotal. There's no evidence for this, but, seems clear to me that it's not as important in a lot of the country anymore. Certainly where I'm from, it's still important. I mean, I haven't lived where I'm from in like 10 years. So, it's like old to me as well. But, there's still parts of the country where people are like that. Maybe not like the Greeks, where you just let strangers in, but, where hospitality is deeply important to their reputation.
Yeah. Yeah, at least among groups of people that kind of know each other, I guess. Like maybe probably among like church communities or
neighbors,
tight-knit neighborhoods, stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Now we're all just on the internet all day, so it's like we don't even. So.
Yeah.
I'm as guilty as anybody. I've lived in this house for a year and a half, and I don't know any of my neighbors. I'm like, hey, sport, whenever they say hi to me. Like, I don't know their name. I'm the worst. Horrible neighbor.
Yeah.
Ben Shapiro would be ashamed. So.
Yeah. Well, while we're still on the subject of honor culture, there's another interesting thing in here that kind of complicates it a little bit. And we saw a little bit of this in the Iliad with Achilles. In the Iliad, while Achilles is sitting out the fight, Agamemnon decides that he wants to, make up with him and bring him back to the fight. And so he sends three men to go talk to Achilles and try to get him to come back to the fight. Those three men are Odysseus, Ajax, and I don't remember the third guy's name. But Ajax, as the second best warrior in the Greek army, appeals to Achilles' honor and says, Agamemnon is willing to restore everything that was taken from you. He will restore you to your full, you will regain the full amount of honor that you had before and more if you just come back to the fight. And Achilles still refuses, and he says he doesn't care about that stuff anymore. And the reason he does eventually come back to the fight is not because of honor; it's because of anger over the death of Patroclus. So we have this, and we talked about this in our last episode about the Iliad, but this warrior is at the pinnacle of honor culture. Like, he is the top guy as far as, being a great warrior goes. And he eventually decides that all of this honor stuff is worthless, and he speaks out against it. He still decides to fight. It's not for honor, but he still does decide to fight. And those two fates that he was foretold to have, he can either stay at Troy and live a short and glorious life and be remembered forever, or he can go home and live out to be an old man and die in obscurity. And he ends up staying and fighting and dying at Troy. So this is during that flashback, that extended flashback sequence where Odysseus is telling his story to the Phaeacians. He tells them how he visited the underworld, he visited Hades, and he spoke to the ghosts of a bunch of dead warriors. And one of those was Achilles. And so he talks to Achilles, and he tells him how fortunate he is to have died such a glorious death. And so here's what Odysseus says to Achilles. He says, I have not yet been anywhere near Achaia, nor yet set foot on my own land, but always run into misfortune. But you, Achilles, no man has been more blessed than you, nor will ever be. While you were alive, we honored you like a god, and now you have come down here, you hold supreme power among the dead. So do not grieve over your death, Achilles. And so this is the view. This is what everyone would think in this culture, right? Like he achieved what every warrior's ultimate goal is, which is to die a glorious death in battle and gain immortality through name repetition. Like, he's done what everyone is supposed to want to do in honor culture. But Achilles answers Odysseus, and he says, do not try to comfort me about death, splendid Odysseus. I would rather be a land laborer, bonded to another man, one who owns no land, and with little enough to keep him alive, than to be king over all the dead who have passed away. So, not only does he say he would rather still be alive, he says he would rather be a slave to a poor man than to have died the glorious death that he died. So it's almost like the dead don't care. The dead don't care how glorious of a death they died. And even though this is entirely what he was supposed to want to do in this culture, he's rebelling against it in death. And so, I said before that I think the moral or kind of the overall theme of the Iliad was that maybe this whole violent culture isn't such a good thing, and I think maybe that's coming through a little bit again here.
Yeah.
It's like the fact that they're immortal through name repetition doesn't matter to people who are dead.
Yeah. 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 I do remember last time you talking about how the Iliad, as much as it's about this glorious story, and it really shows it's more tragic than anything. If you think about what Achilles' story, like his anger, takes him so far, and there's just no satisfaction, even when he gets his vengeance and all that, right?
Yeah.
It's not until he lets go, that he finally feels some semblance of peace, or whatever. So, yeah, we talked about it last time. It's a mixed bag because it's clearly like a good, glorious thing that you can read through it. But if there's like the end of it, you kind of walk away from it. It's almost like a cautionary tale, and if not about honor culture in general, at least about like vengeance, which is a part of honor culture for sure, and holding on to grudges and all that. So we talked about that before, and yeah, this may be further proof of that after he had this glorious death and achieved everything anyone could hope for, like with his infinite wisdom of being immortal, he wishes he could do it again, and wishes he hadn't done what he did and would trade it all. So
yeah, just to be alive.
So even further demonstrates the tragedy of Achilles after he died.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, the Iliad did make honor culture a little bit more complicated than just be a great warrior and die a glorious death.
Yeah.
But I think the Odyssey makes it even more complicated. Like it brings in a lot more of the peacetime virtues, like we talked about before, and also this. Like,
yeah,
it's better to be like the greatest warrior ever is saying it's better to be a slave, a living slave, than to be a warrior, a dead warrior who has died a glorious death.
Yeah, dead hero.
Yeah.
Yeah, and to think about the audience, if some bard is going around, like telling the Odyssey to people, it's like, what's the message there? It's like Achilles himself doesn't think that this was the best option, that this glorious death, that the warrior honor culture didn't, that it wasn't actually the best answer. So,
yeah.
It almost seems like they're like, not propaganda, but like they're trying to teach Greeks to be less like, because it was certainly written a long time after the events that are supposed to have happened, right? And it's all, it's Homeric, because Homer wrote it, as in, it's definitely Hollywoodized, you know what I mean? If there's any historical truth to it, there's obviously a lot of myth to it. But if there were actual events, like there was a Trojan War, there probably was an Achilles, a person called Achilles, possibly, maybe, probably. But it would have been way, way after that, before the Iliad was a thing,
Yeah, before it got written down.
Right. So before Homer did his take on it, he didn't live during, the Trojan War or, the immediate aftermath. So anyway, yeah, maybe to them, this is antiquity. This is looking back in their ancient history when they're hearing this story.
Yeah, this is at least like several hundred years in the past for them.
Yeah, so even for them, it's like kind of archaic, and certainly they have their own honor culture, and I'm sure there's a lot of virtues they take from these stories and they try and live by them. But yeah, maybe it's a cautionary tale. Maybe it's a warning about a more barbaric past.
Or it's just a sign that the culture is starting to evolve.
Yeah,
like like maybe it's not even necessarily propaganda. It's just that it's not like a conscious message that was put in there. It's just the fact that people are starting to change the way they think, and those changes start to make their way into the stories.
Yeah, and this is, they're looking back at a Greece before Socrates and oh my God, what's the other guy's name? Plato, right?
Aristotle.
This is like before that philosophical movement, so this is before. So yeah, you could see that's a pretty drastic difference between being like just a ferocious barbaric warrior culture to being this more philosophical culture, and Greece was both. So I could see like they're pointing back to a time before the great ancient thinkers, and certainly I would imagine they're trying to, like, they look back on it with probably both reverence and disdain for how their ancestors were, when they were certainly more primitive.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, you got anything more on that?
Nope.
Move on. Yeah, another thing. There's something about the story that bothered me for a little while, and that's how good Odysseus is at lying.
Yeah.
Like, he is a great liar. I said before that he has this great ability to craft a story and tailor it to his audience, but he also has a great ability to just plain make up a story out of nowhere. Like, he fabricates stories.
I wanted to chime in when you said that, and I was like, he's a good liar, but I thought I'd wait until we were ready to talk about it. But yeah, and that's interesting with the whole honor culture thing too, because he's like known for it and good at it and proud of it, and everybody reveres him for it, like his ability to
it's
craft
weird.
a story. And I think it's part of. I think he's clearly like a great warrior, but he's like the tactician. He's the great strategist, and so he basically just seems like a genius compared to everybody else. And that whether that's so he's not just he's good at coming up with battle plans, and that happens several times. He's known for it, but he's also good at crafting lies, crafting a story, and that comes up several times, and it is kind of funny. It doesn't seem like lying is such a big deal in this honor culture that they have.
The Odyssey is definitely much more of a story of brains over brawn compared to the Iliad. But I think, like, I have a theory about this, and this bothered me for a little while. I'm like, why is lying a good thing? Because I'm at a point now where philosophers and thinkers that I respect, like Sam Harris or Jordan Peterson or any of those modern people that I respect and listen to, kind of the one of the primary ideas that I've gotten from all of those people is don't lie. Like, tell the truth. And Sam Harris wrote a whole book about this called Lying, where he basically makes the argument that lying is almost never justified. Like, even in situations where you'd think it would be obviously justified, he makes a pretty strong case that there's got to be some really, really extenuating circumstances for lying to be a good thing. And so it's weird because that's kind of where my view is now. I'm like, just don't lie. Like, it's bad. It's not a good thing to do. But the Odyssey, at first glance at least, it seems to be propping it up as a virtue, as one of Odysseus' virtues. So this bothered me. But I have a theory on what I think is going on here. I think the actual virtue that's being propped up is not the lying itself, it's the tactical mind.
Mm-hmm.
I got this from Sam Harris's book, Lying, also. Because in that book, he says that in order to decide to lie, you've basically decided. He puts lying on a continuum of violence. It's like part of the escalation of force, right?
Mm-hmm. So
if there are situations where a person would be justified in using physical force, that, if we take lying as part of the escalation of force, then there's also situations in which lying would be justified.
Yeah.
And those are really, like he says in this book, that those are, you've basically decided that if you're going to tell a lie, then there's no chance of forming a relationship with this person. Like, you've decided that violence may be justified in this situation. And lying itself is like a low level of violence. So taking that to the Odyssey, there's, like, when Odysseus gets back home and he disguises himself as a beggar.
Right. So hold that thought before you get there. Sorry. It's not that Sam Harris is saying that lying is violence or like violence. He's saying you should only employ it in similar situations where you would employ violence. That's the only justified employment of lies. It's not that he's equating them like they're like a lie is violence. It's that. Right. Okay, got it. Just wanted to clear that up.
Yeah, speech is not violence.
Yes, okay.
Lefty is.
Yes.
Anyway.
All right, sorry, go ahead.
So yes, if you're justified in using physical force, you're also justified in lying, according to Sam Harris.
Okay.
So anyway, if we take that view, right?
Mm-hmm.
Odysseus gets back home, and these suitors are eating up all this stuff and just acting, going back to Xenia, this hospitality culture. Mm-hmm. They are violating it in every way, in every possible way. And this is, like, everyone can see this. They are terrible people. According to the story, in this situation, Odysseus is justified in killing all of the suitors, right? Like, the story wants us to believe that he's justified in killing all of them, which he eventually does. And so physical force is justified here. So lying is also justified. Like, so it's a tool in the toolbox, right?
Yeah, and he uses his lies are useful. He does it for a reason. It's almost like the tactician thing, like you were saying. It's like deceiving your enemy. It's no different than a battlefield. You don't tell your enemy what you're going to do, and misinformation is a huge part of battle combat. You know what I mean? And it's I think it's in a very similar light almost every time he does it. Or it's like a step on the path to some ultimate goal that is, making violence on these men and getting home.
Yeah, so he lies to people, and it's like dishonesty is a tool in the toolbox that he has at his disposal, and he uses it very effectively. And I think that, and so the point is, I think that the virtue that's being propped up is not the lying itself, but it's the tactical mind. It's the ability to use all the tools at your disposal. And that's one tool that he can use very well.
Yeah, he's very clever.
And so the one, you said that all his lies are useful, and they all are, except for one, which is at the end. And I think this is the one exception that I think illustrates the point even better. And it's at the end. This is after he's already killed all the suitors, and he goes to visit his father, Laertes.
Mm-hmm.
And when he first comes upon his father, he makes up a story to his father. Like he says, he tells him some story that he, he's a traveler who met Odysseus once, and this is what he tells his father.
Mm-hmm.
There's no reason for him to lie at this point, right? Like he's already defeated the suitors, and the battle's over, and he doesn't need to disguise himself anymore. He's even already revealed himself to his household after this, and to his wife. And so he tells his father this completely unnecessary lie. And his father is just devastated, right? Like he cries and he throws dirt on his head. Apparently that's a thing people did back then when they were upset. And so Odysseus sees this, like he sees his father's reaction, and he immediately realizes, I shouldn't be doing this. And he immediately turns around and tells his father who he really is.
Yeah.
And so it's like he immediately realizes that he did something wrong there. And that this lie wasn't justified. And so it's not a good thing. And I think this kind of highlights, like, even though the rest of his lies were for a purpose and were in service of his ultimate goal of taking back his rightful place, they still have an effect on his character.
Yeah.
It's like, even though they were necessary, they still negatively affected his character to the point where he just got so used to lying that he was, that he did it when he didn't need to. It's like,
dude, I literally thought that at the time when I read that. I was like, I remember as I was reading it, I thought this, like, he's just so used to lying now that he doesn't even mean to. He's just doing it every time he meets somebody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like, I think the moral is, if you ever do find yourself in a situation where you need to do something bad or something, borderline immoral out of necessity, be careful, because even if it's necessary, it'll still affect your character. Like you can't just do stuff like that and not have it affect you in the long term,
Yeah. Yeah. It's one thing to justify it to yourself and feel, moral about it, but it doesn't mean that it isn't changing you for the worse, for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
That's it for part 1 of our discussion on the Odyssey. Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did, and we hope you'll join us again for part 2, which should be posted in the next week or so after this one, and if you're listening, pretty near the time of release. We'll see you then. If you like this show, there are many ways you can support it. You can talk about it on your own blog or podcast, you can share it on social media with your friends, or you can leave a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you happen to listen to it. If you're watching on YouTube, you can subscribe to the channel and hit the thumbs up button if you like this video. Thank you for your support, and we'll see you next time on Philosophication.